Good evening and welcome to the 10th week of St. Joseph of Arimathea Anglican Theological College's Genesis class. I'm Mike Mautner, the rector of St. Peter's Church in Oakland, California. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who hast caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant that we may in such wise hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that by patience and comfort of thy holy word we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life which thou hast given us in thy Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. A couple of holes in the lecture last week that I wanted to fill. At one point I was making reference to the Bruce Feiler book, Walking the Bible. That's what it looks like. And he mentioned something about Abraham carrying the fire as he and Isaac are walking to Mount Moriah for the great testing of faith in Genesis 22. And I mentioned that we often think of, for most of us modern readers, picture Abraham carrying a torch or something. And here's what Mr. Feiler's guide, the Israeli archaeologist, says about this, and I'm just going to read it to you because it's interesting. It was so difficult to make fire, Avner explained, that they carried a charcoal ember. Bedouin do it even now, he said. They have a special plant like cane. They put the charcoal inside the husk, wrap it in cotton, and it burns slowly all day. At night, they break the cane, blow on the charcoal, and start the fire. I thought that was an interesting little tidbit of information. If they were walking during the day, of course, they wouldn't need to have a torch, but they would need a fire for later. Difficult to make fire in that area. Also, some citations I should have given in the last couple of minutes of the lecture. I mentioned chapter 23 of Genesis, and I think I've said almost everything that can be said about it. The importance of it, or what I think the importance of it is to Christian belief, the tomb of the patriarchs and the purchase of that tomb by Abraham upon Sarah's death. But there are a couple of things that I wanted to mention in addition. Vysotsky, the Genesis of Ethics, chapter 9 of the book, is about the purchase of the tomb of the patriarchs. And he does something interesting. He sees three different potential interpretations of the bartering that goes on between Abraham and the Hittites. It talks about the Hittites wanting to do something nice for Abraham as one interpretation. Another interpretation is Abraham as a sharp bargainer. And I think that he misses the mark on what's going on, because it seems to me that the bargaining that goes on between Abraham and the Hittites in the purchase of that tomb is actually very formalized and probably conformed to the generalized rituals. Remember, in a civilization that was primarily oral, where things were not written down, outward rituals where certain things happen, certain words are said, and certain conclusions come to and sealed then by actions. That kind of formality is important, and that's what I think primarily is going on. But no matter what interpretation you go with as to the motives of the parties to that negotiation, the end is the same. He has a deed, that kind of deed that existed then. He has paid for a plot, and he has purchased the double cave and field at Kiryat Arba, which is Hebron. By his own initiative, he has bought the promise that God has given him. That's on page 119 of Vysotsky. I said last week it's important to look at that because everything about heaven that is seen in the Old Testament is on the literal level really about the land of Israel, the promised land, the city of Jerusalem as the city of peace. We sang not long ago in Mass at St. Peter's, we sang hymn 585, Jerusalem, my happy home, when shall I come to thee? It's a song about heaven, entirely in terms of Jerusalem. That's typical of the way Christians read the Old Testament, the allegorical way. We read the Old Testament, and in that light, in that way, I read chapter 23 as an allegory for the relationship between the tomb of Christ and our toehold in heaven. I said that the tomb of the patriarchs, the land, the plot that Abraham buys in chapter 23 of Genesis, turns out to be the children of Israel's toehold in the promised land, because it's the only part of the land that they actually get title to, despite all that wandering around. I made a mistake. I said in the last 2 minutes of last week's lecture that Genesis says they carried Joseph's bones out when they left Egypt. Of course not. Genesis says that Joseph's bones were entombed in Egypt, and the site for that is Genesis 50:26. It's just about the last sentence in the book of Genesis, that Joseph's bones were entombed in Egypt, with Joseph extracting a promise from his brothers that his bones will be brought to the land of Israel to be buried with his fathers. And of course, this actually happens and helps to connect the subsequent books of the Hebrew Bible to one another. In Exodus 13:19, it says that Moses carried Joseph's bones with him out of Egypt. That's Exodus 13:19. And then at the very end of the book of Joshua, when the land of Israel has been, or at least seems to have been, conquered by the Israelites under Joshua's leadership, and the land has been divided extremely specifically in the last or next to last few chapters of the book of Joshua, you get the plat map essentially in prose of the Holy Land. What land belongs to all the different tribes and the subdivisions of the different tribes. And you will see that acted on in subsequent books of the Hebrew Bible. It becomes a background fact that explains some things that might otherwise be mysterious. But Joshua chapter 24, verse 32 says that they finally buried the bones of Joshua in the Holy Land. One final error from last week's lecture I'd like to correct now. I simply made one of those mistakes I seem to make about just saying the wrong word. Not a good flaw for a teacher to have. One of the mistakes I made was I said that at the end of chapter 22 of Genesis, the midrash on the end of chapter 22 is that it says that Abraham comes down from Mount Moriah and comes to his lads, and it's important to notice that Isaac is not with him. And one of the midrash on that is that looking at the beginning of chapter 23, you see the death of Sarah. So one of the midrash is that Sarah followed Abraham and she got to Mount Moriah somehow, and she's there at the foot of Mount Moriah, and she sees Abraham coming down the mountain alone and promptly drops dead. Well, what I said last week was that she didn't see Abraham. What I meant to say, of course, was that she did not see Isaac, and that the midrash says she dropped dead as a result of that. So Abraham's story is almost over. He has one important thing left to do. He's got to find a wife for his son, because he has to ensure that the promise is going to continue. And as chapter 24 of the book of Genesis opens, Abraham is speaking to his manservant, The elder of his household is the way that Robert Alter translates it, the person who rules over all the things that was his, or that were his. Abraham is old, advanced in years. The Lord had blessed him in many things, and I'm paraphrasing chapter 24 now. Abraham makes this servant, who is unnamed, but I think is named earlier in the text when Abraham is complaining to God that, you said that I'm going to have all these children, but the way it is right now, my servant, the head of my household, is going to wind up inheriting all my property. He makes that servant in chapter 24 take an oath. And as I just got done saying with respect to the sealing of the bargain for the purchase of the tomb of the patriarchs, the subject matter of chapter 23, here is another ritual, a way of verifying legal and binding commitments by actions. Put your hand, pray, under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord, God of the heavens and God of the earth, that you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanite in whose midst I dwell. But to my land and to my birthplace you shall go, and you shall take a wife for my son Isaac. And the servant said to him, Hey, maybe this woman won't come back to the land. Shall I then bring your son to her in the land that you left? Abraham said, No, don't you bring my son back to the land that I left. He's afraid that Isaac will wind up settling back in the old country and defeating God's promise by that. If the woman, verse 8, if the woman should not want to go after you, you shall be clear of this vow of mine. Only my son you must not bring back there. So Abraham asks that the servant take a vow with this particular ritual involved, and the servant asks some questions about the vow. Abraham clarifies exactly what his instructions are, and the servant put his hand under Abraham's thigh, and he swore to him concerning this thing. And then he went out to fulfill that promise. He took 10 of his master's camels with bounty from Abraham, and he rose and he went to the land of Aram, to the city of Nahor. And remember, at the end of chapter 22 is the genealogy of Rebekah, who now becomes the focus of the action in chapter 24. This particular ritual of swearing an oath. When you go into a court, today you will still raise your right hand and either swear or affirm, in California, the truth of your testimony. They're still having the President of the United States put his hand on a Bible. And often that Bible is something significant from American history, like the Bible that Lincoln was sworn in on, has been used by several subsequent presidents to solemnize the event. And the raising of the right hand is one of the signs of the oath. Well, if you want to really make the oath serious, and things in the Middle East have often been like this, putting a hand under the thigh, which means, since these are two men we're talking about, the hand is really, really close to a very tender asset and something that can be injured rather easily. So putting the hand there is a sign that this is a really serious oath you are swearing. And if you break this oath, I'm going to be in a position to really hurt you. And that solemnizes the act in a way that holds and binds the person making the oath to that act and to the relationship with the person to whom he swears that he will do the act that he swears to do. I could put all this in the vernacular, but I leave that to your own vivid imaginations. So what about Rebekah? This nameless servant of Abraham goes to the city of Nahor, where Nahor's family lives, and he goes to where the women come on the outskirts of the city by the well of water to draw water for the evening and the next day. And he makes a prayer, which then gets repeated 2 times in different contexts in the course of chapter 24, which is a little long as chapters in Genesis go. He makes this prayer to God that, God, show me who I'm looking for. Show me who is supposed to be the wife of my master's son, Isaac. Whatever woman comes up to me and says, here, let me draw water for you, and let me draw water for your camels also. And this would have been an extraordinary promise, an extraordinary offer, because camels need a lot of water. And if he's got 10 camels, you're talking about a lot of water that this woman, whoever she might be, is going to promise to draw for the servant once he gets to Nahor. And chapter 24, verse 15, he had barely finished speaking to God about this sign that the servant asks for, when, look, Rebekah was coming out, who was born to Bethuel, son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, with her jug on her shoulders. And the young woman was very comely to look at, a virgin, no man had known her. And she came down to the spring and filled her jug and came back up. And the servant ran after her and asks her for a bit of water from the jug. And she said, drink, my lord. And she hurried and lowered her jug onto her hand and let him drink from her hand. And then she said, for your camels too I shall draw water until they drink their fill. And she hurried and emptied her jug into the trough, and she ran again to the well to draw water, and drew water for all his camels. And the man was staring at her, keeping silent to know whether the Lord had granted success to his journey. And it happened. All the camels had drunk their fill. She not only said she would do something, but then she went ahead and did it, and it was a big deal. This is taking some kind of jug and filling it over and over with water 10 times and filling the trough so that all of these camels can drink. When the camels had drunk their fill, verse 22, the man took a ring and 2 bracelets, 10 gold shekels in weight, and was going to give them to her as a gift, and asks, whose daughter are you? And she tells him. And then the servant thanks God. Blessed be the Lord God of my master Abraham, who has not let off his steadfast kindness toward my master. Me on this journey the Lord led to the house of my master's kinsman. Rebekah is Abraham's niece, the first cousin of Isaac, whom she is to marry. Now, the rest of chapter 24 has a couple of important things. The discussion between Rebekah's brother Laban, who will be a very important character when we get to the son of Rebekah and Isaac, Jacob. Laban, the brother of Rebekah, is the one who makes the agreement with the servant for Rebekah to go back to the land of Israel. And the servant repeats to Laban almost everything Abraham said to him, repeats the story of the camels and the servant's prayer, and then tells Laban what happened. So this is a lot of repetition, and it comes to verse 48 when things start to get new and the discussion proceeds to what's going to happen next. So, verse 49, this is the servant to Laban. If you are going to act with steadfast kindness toward my master, tell me, and if not, tell me that I may turn elsewhere. You going to let your sister go so she can marry her cousin? Or do I have to keep on this journey now that I've told you this whole story? And Laban and Bethuel answered and said, from the Lord this thing has come. We can speak to you neither good nor evil. Here is Rebekah before you. Take her and go and let her be wife to your master's son as the Lord has spoken. two things about this. The family of Abraham, even though they are living in northern Syria or close to Haran, which may be over the border of what's now modern Iraq, not exactly sure where the boundaries were, the boundary of the city at that time, they believe in the Lord. They believe in Adonai, Yahweh. They believe in God. And that belief is something that has been shown by the repetition of everything that has come before, coming out of the servant's mouth. It's a test of whether or not they see the providence of God in these actions that have occurred, just as Abraham's servant sees the providence of God. And they do, and they make the promise. And Abraham's servant heard their words and bowed to the ground to the Lord. And the servant then takes out all kinds of other gifts and gives them to Rebekah and gives presents to her brother and her mother. That's Bethuel. Her father's dead, but Bethuel lives, the mother. And then they have a big feast. And the men who were with him, and they spent the night and rose in the morning and said, "Send me off that I may go to my master." And here we have some of this bargaining, maybe some of this ritual of negotiation, or it may be the character of Laban being foreshadowed for the story of Jacob. This is verse 55. And her brother and her mother said, "Let the young woman stay with us 10 days or so, then she may go." And he said, you can see they're getting some seller's remorse. And he said to them, "Do not hold me back when the Lord has granted success to my journey. Send me off that I may go to my master." And they said, "Let us call the young woman and ask for her answer." So they've made this promise that they have the power to make as the head male of the extended family and the mother of the young girl. But now they're going to be nice and ask her what she thinks. And they called Rebekah and said to her, "Will you go with this man?" And she said, "I will." And they sent off Rebekah their sister and her nurse and Abraham's servant and his men, and they blessed Rebekah and said to her, and this is one of those interpolated pieces of verse, Professor Alter believes, "Our sister, become hence, myriads teeming. May your seed take hold of the gate of its foes." Similar to what God says to Abraham after Abraham has not withheld his son, his only son, from sacrifice to God, the promise of triumph over one's enemies. And then a couple of things happen at the end of chapter 24 that are significant. Rebekah and her young women go, they mount the camels and go with the servant. And verse 62, Isaac had come from the approach to Beer Lahai Roi as he was dwelling in the Negeb region. And Isaac went out to stroll in the field toward evening, and he raised his eyes and saw, and look, camels were coming. And Rebekah raised her eyes and saw Isaac. And she alighted from the camel, and she said to the servant, "Who is that man walking through the field toward us?" And the servant said, "He is my master." And she took her veil and covered her face. And the servant recounted to Isaac all the things he had done. And the author or redactor, editor of Genesis is merciful not to repeat everything again in this context. And Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah his mother, and took Rebekah as wife, and he loved her, and Isaac was consoled after his mother's death. I said earlier, it may have been in the very first lecture, when I was speaking of man-woman relations in this historical context, that the woman, the head wife, had her own tent. And this is actually how we know that. It's biblical evidence. Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah his mother, and took Rebekah as his wife. And he loved her, and was consoled for his mother's death. one other important literary motif, the raising up of the eyes. Remember, Abraham has called the site on which the near sacrifice occurred, the Lord sees, or the Lord caused me to see, Adonai Yireh. And here you have this same motif. Isaac raises his eyes. Rebekah raises her eyes. They see each other, and each other become their consolation and their completion, and also the completion of the cycle that really starts with the departure of Hagar and Ishmael from the camp of Abraham, because some of the same literary motifs are used by the author in that context. Chapter 25, we see the end of Abraham. And the end of Abraham is put in an interesting context. Suddenly, there's another wife, a third wife. And Abraham took another wife, and her name was Keturah. And then there's all of the descendants of Keturah. And Abraham gave everything he had to Isaac, chapter 25, verse 6, and to the sons of Abraham's concubines, plural, Abraham gave gifts while he was still alive and sent them away from Isaac, his son, eastward, to the land of the east. And he did the same with the sons of Keturah. The most important sons of Keturah for future purposes are Midian and Sheba. Midian will become the refuge of Moses when Moses flees Egypt, and he will marry the daughter of a priest of Midian. But then subsequently the Midianites will become enemies of the Israelites once they are settled in the land of Israel, much later. And Sheba. Sheba becomes Ethiopia, one of the families of Ethiopia. And the queen of Sheba, of course, comes to visit Solomon. And there's some legendary information about that, which is also important to the identity today of the Afro-Israelis, the Falashas, who were a community of Jews in Ethiopia who traced their lineage all the way back to Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. And they were in grave danger when Ethiopia fell apart at the end of the Cold War. And they were rescued by an Israeli military mission to airlift them out of Egypt entirely, the entire community. And that has been a fascinating story of modern integration. They've had a rough time, and Israel has had a rough time absorbing them. But it's an interesting story, and it dates back all the way to the children of Abraham by the wife named Keturah. And Abraham lived to be 175 years. He breathed his last, and he was gathered to his fathers, or to his kinfolk. And here's the nice part. We go back to that tomb. And Isaac and Ishmael his sons buried him in the Machpelah cave in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite, which faces Mamre, the field that Abraham had bought from the Hittites. There was Abraham buried, and Sarah his wife. And it happened after Abraham's death that God blessed Isaac his son, and Isaac settled near Beer Lahai Roi. And then we get the next Toledot. This is the end of the Toledot of Terah, the father of Abraham. And we get the lineage of Ishmael. We get all of Ishmael's lineage, his sons, the 12 sons, 12 chieftains according to their tribes, verse 16. Ishmael lives 137 years. He is not buried in the tomb of the patriarchs. And there his descendants, Ishmael's descendants, range from Havilah to Shur, which faces Egypt, until you come to Asher, in defiance of all his brothers, he went down. So the sons of Ishmael, remember Ishmael went and took a wife of the Egyptians and became a wild man and a wanderer. And that's actually the end of the Toledot of Ishmael. The next Toledot begins, and this is the lineage of Isaac, son of Abraham. Abraham begot Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took as wife Rebekah. And Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife, for she was barren. This is another repeating theme of the barrenness of birth. It goes all the way from Sarah up to turning the image slightly, the Virgin Mary. Miracle babies are part of God's proof of his intentions to his people. And she gets pregnant, and there are twins inside of her, and they are fighting each other in the womb. And she prays. She went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, 2 nations in your womb, 2 peoples from your loins shall issue. People over people shall prevail, the elder the younger's slave. And the elder that came out was ruddy, his hair like a mantle all over, as if he were, in fact, clothed. That's the image. And his name was called Esau. And then his brother came out, his hand grasping Esau's heel, and they called his name Yaakov. And Isaac was 60 years old when they were born, so 20 years for Rebekah to conceive. And there's the original meaning of the name Yaakov was probably something like either God protects. Yah is one of the morphemes, the pieces of sound, pieces of meaning that refer to God. It's the first syllable of Yahweh, Yah. So Yaakov may originally have meant God protects or God follows after. But the image is of a supplanter. He is following after Esau as if he were trying to keep him from getting into the womb. And there will be a later coda to this story also in Genesis. We'll get to that, where 2 twins war in the womb, and there's difficulty telling which one came out first. One final point about this story so far as we get to, we're basically almost done with Isaac. Isaac is, the most Isaac does is in chapter 22 and then again in chapter 25, where he is basically an object. First the object, at least the text treats him like an object. The object of Abraham in 22. In 25, he's going to be an object of Rebekah and Jacob's plot to fulfill God's promise to Rebekah that the younger son is going to come out on top in the long run. You see, this is a pattern among the so-called matriarchs of Israel. Sarah, it was Sarah's idea to have Abraham sleep with Hagar to fulfill God's promise, and it's going to be Rebekah's idea, and Jacob is responsible for it because he goes along to try to trick the aged Isaac into making his primary heir Jacob, the younger son, rather than Esau, the older son. When I was growing up, American Judaism was in the throes of some extensive change that people who were in the Episcopal Church at the same time will remember because it was similar. And feminism and the role of women was one of the leading factors and one of the things that was being argued about. And one of the things that this took the form of was a debate over how to name God. And God is named in Exodus as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's how, at first, God introduces himself to Moses. I'm the God of your fathers. I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. In Jewish worship, that becomes a formula. It becomes a formula, a formulaic name of God. One of the great prayers of the Sabbath service. Elohei Avraham v'Elohei Yaakov v'Elohei Isaac. I got the order wrong, but it's the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. The fight at that time was to change that formula from the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah. And of course, in most of Judaism, that particular formula won out. The main Orthodox argument against it, and I think it's borne out by Scripture, is that the matriarchs of Israel, those four names, not so sure about Rachel and Leah. They may very well have bought in to God. But Rebekah and Sarah and Rebekah really sort of didn't. You know, Sarah laughs at God. Rebekah has a holding on before she leaves, and so does Rachel before she leaves, which we'll see in a subsequent chapter. And I'll talk about that more when we get to it. It's foreshadowed in the part of this Rebekah story in chapter 24 that I skipped. And now chapter 25. Or excuse me, chapter 26. Actually, I'm sorry, it starts at the end of chapter 25. Michael, let's start again. And now the story of Esau and Jacob begins at chapter 25, verse 27. Talks about them growing up and the different kinds of people that Esau and Jacob become. Esau he's remember the hairy man. He becomes skilled in hunting, a man of the field, and the favorite of his father, just as Ishmael was much beloved of Abraham, and they went hunting together. Whereas Jacob was a simple man, a dweller in tents. In other words, he was a mama's boy. And that's exactly what he proves himself to be in the remainder of this particular story. Isaac loved Esau for the game that he brought him, for the hunting, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And Jacob prepared a stew one day, and Esau came in from hunting, and he was famished. Or he came in from the field, and he was famished. And Jacob's already made this stew, this pottage, and Esau says to Jacob, "Let me gulp down some of this red stuff, for I am famished." Therefore is his name called Edom. Edom is a pun on the word for red, or from literally "this is red," which is the word for stew, which is nazid. So Edom comes from nazid, the Hebrew word for stew. And this is an insult. Calling him Edom is an insult. It's saying that he is a carnal man, if you will, a man for whom the stew is more important than. Jacob said, "Sell now your birthright to me." And Esau said, "Look, I'm at the point of death, so what do I need a birthright for?" Jacob says, "Swear to me now." And he swore to him, and he sold his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, so not even the red stuff. And he ate and he drank, and he rose and he went off. And Esau spurned his birthright. Alter points out that the rapid-fire chain of verbs nicely expresses the precipitous manner in which Esau gulps down his food and, as the verse concludes, casts away his birthright. The birthright is the right to be the head of the clan when the patriarch of the clan dies. Isaac is the head of an extensive household with many servants and considerable wealth. Esau is the firstborn, has the right to that, and it is so unimportant to him that he's willing to throw it away for a stew or for some of that red stuff that is like him, because there's also some connection between redness and hairiness, at least where Esau is concerned. So that takes us to the end of chapter 25. It's interesting that Jacob doesn't seem to be planning this at all. It's sort of like his brother comes up to him and he's already got this stew and he says, hey, sell me your birthright. Jacob, this is a crime of opportunity, if you will. Well, it's not really a crime, but Jacob sees an opening and takes it, and the birthright is given over. So what does a father have to give other than a birthright? By the way, there is evidence from some of the archives that have been dug up in this area, and I've mentioned them before. There is evidence that this kind of thing did happen. The birthright could actually be purchased by another sibling without the consent of the father. You would think that the father was the one who had the right to alienate that because it's his, but the father does not have the right to just give it to whoever he wants at whim. It's something that's important to the entire clan, to everyone in the family, and he can, if he gives it away, it has to be for some kind of compensation. This was a pretty cheap trade, giving away the birthright, the headship of the household, for a bowl of lentil soup or lentil stew. Pretty extraordinary. Now, chapter 26, speaking of crimes of opportunity, it happens again that Isaac is going to go and pull the same scam on a local king. In fact, the king of the same neighboring Canaanite city-state that Abraham last swindled back in chapter 20. Gerar. There is once again a famine in the land, and Isaac goes to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines at Gerar. Remember, Avimelech means my father, the king. Before he decides to go there because of the famine, the Lord appears to Isaac and says, don't go to Egypt. Stay in the land that I shall say to you. Sojourn in this land that I may be with you and bless you. And then the promise to Abraham is repeated. And Abraham is praised by God, and the promise is repeated. And then Isaac goes to Gerar instead. He's going to go to Egypt. God says no. Beautiful language in verses 2 through 5 of chapter 26. The repetition of the promises that God made to Abraham, with an interesting coda, since this is the second generation. I will give to your seed all these lands, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed through your seed, because Abraham has listened to my voice and has kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my teachings. And then next verse, and Isaac dwelled in Gerar. Well, he obeyed God. He didn't, at least halfway. He didn't go down to Egypt, but neither did he stay exactly where he was. He stayed in the land of Israel, but he goes and seeks the protection of another king and tells him, hey, this isn't my wife, this is my sister. We've seen this scam run before, and it has precisely the same impact as it had in chapters 12 and 20 when Abraham pulled it in Egypt and in Gerar with a king named Abimelech. Presumably not the same Abimelech. You wouldn't think somebody would fall for this twice, but his son might. And as I said before, Abimelech, in a prior lecture, Abimelech is probably a regnal name, something that every king of that city is called. So the plot is discovered because some problems happen. And in this case, they're actually discovered because Isaac is fondling Rebekah. And he is spotted by the king of the Philistines, who looks out the window and sees it. And the king is horrified. He assumes immediately, not that incest is going on, but that they are in fact married. It's kind of charitable of the king to think that. And that all that they're doing is lying to him about who is married to him. Abimelech says, "What is this you have done?" Verse 10, "One of the people might well have lain with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us." So it doesn't actually happen this time, as it may have with Sarah in Egypt and Gerar, because a curse came upon the land as a result of Sarah being in the harem of Pharaoh and then in the household of Abimelech of Gerar. Once this is found out in time, the king lets them stay, doesn't eject them from the city-state, but makes a proclamation that if anybody touches Isaac and Rebekah, that person is condemned to death. Isaac stays there, he plants, he reaps 100-fold what he plants in the ground of Gerar in that year, and he becomes an even greater man. He becomes even richer, and we have the issue of wells brought up. As most people who follow news of the Middle East today, water is still a huge issue. It's a very important thing in the Near East. So when Jesus says, "Come to me, I will give you a water that will never make you thirsty, that will slake your thirst forever, because I am the water of life, the well of life." That's a very powerful image. It should be to everybody, because you got to have water to live. But in the Middle East, it's an especially revered image. And a fight starts. Because he is so rich, because Isaac is so rich in Gerar, the Philistines envy him, and all the wells that his father's servants had dug up in the days of Abraham, the Philistines blocked up, filling them with earth. This is chapter 26, verse 15. They're trying to drive him away. And this is obviously in the land around Gerar, land where Abraham and his servants had dug wells. And after a time passes and this happens, Abimelech says to Isaac, "Go away from us. You've grown far too powerful for us," foreshadowing the reason that the Pharaoh who knew not Joseph gave for enslaving the Israelites in Egypt. It had to do with how big they got as a community, how powerful they were. And Isaac, as a result, leaves, and he encamps in the Wadi of Gerar. A wadi is a dry creek of a particular kind that cuts through the desert rock in this part of the world. And Isaac dug anew the wells of water that had been dug in the days of Abraham his father, which the Philistines had blocked up. And he gave them the names that his father had given them. And Isaac's servants dug in the wadi, and they found there a fresh well of water. And then there's a fight going to brew between the shepherds of Gerar, the city-state ruled by Abimelech, and the shepherds of Isaac. And he calls the name of the well he dug in the wadi, Esek, for they had contended with him, and they dug another well and quarreled over it, and its name is Sitnah, which has a meaning of accusation or hostility. And then he pulled up stakes from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it, and he called its name Rehoboth. And he said, "For now the Lord has given us space, that we may be fruitful in the land." This replays an incident from the life of Abraham with more elaborate emphasis. And it works nicely as the preparation for the next round in the Jacob-Esau conflict. A water source is not easily divisible. So the spiteful act of the Philistines in blocking up the wells so that not just Isaac's shepherds, but anybody could get water. I mean, they're really cutting their noses off to spite their face by plugging the wells. If we can't have the water, we can't be in charge of the water, nobody's going to have it, is basically what they are saying. And we're being prepared by this in a foreshadowing kind of way, to speak in literary terms, for the conflict between Esau and Jacob. Esau and Jacob. And the rest of chapter 26 is a continuation of the discussion of the Lord with Isaac. Isaac went up to Beersheba. The Lord appeared to him and said, "Fear not, I am with you. I will bless you." And Isaac builds an altar, something that he hasn't done yet in the course of this narrative. He builds an altar. He invokes the name of the Lord, verse 25, and he starts digging a well. And here comes Abimelech, the king of Gerar, and he's trying to make peace because this whole well thing has been going on. And the king of Gerar says, "We see the Lord is with you. Let's make an oath and let's make peace." And they did so. They made a feast. They ate and drank. And then they found more water. And again, a genealogy of sorts, or a piece of data, is the end of the chapter. And Esau was 40 years old and took as his wife Judith, the daughter of Beri the Hittite, and Besamath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. He takes two wives who are both Hittites, and they were a provocation to Isaac and to Rebekah. So not only does Esau sell his birthright, but then he goes off and marries Goyim, much to the consternation of his parents. All of this in the context of this fight over water. And one of the other ways of translating that provocation is that it was a source of bitterness to Isaac and to Rebekah. And that might play into the motivation of Rebekah in doing what she does in chapter 27, which is well worth going into some significant detail on. And I guess we will do that next week. I want to take a moment to do something that I did in the lost second lecture of this series. If you go back and look at number 1 and what's now labeled number 2, you'll see there was one I did that got destroyed. It was at a different platform. We were doing live streaming, and there were all kinds of technical difficulties. And I finally realized that what I had done in that lecture was define a whole lot of important terms, including the term allegory, which is an important term. It's the way that Paul describes his use of the Old Testament in Galatians. These things are an allegory. As I said at the end of the last lecture and earlier in this lecture, I'm saying that about chapter 23 and our relationship to Christ. His tomb is our foot in the door of the promised land of heaven. His death is the beginning of our resurrection. That's an allegorical understanding of the text. Well, let's look at some definitions of these terms. This is a poetry workshop book by the poet Stephen Fry, and it has a wonderful glossary, and it has excellent definitions of some terms. And I read those in that second lecture, and I think I should repeat them here for people who didn't hear them then and now can't hear them because that particular lecture was destroyed. This all started because a viewer wrote in. I said in the first lecture that Paul has a polemical purpose in Galatians when he uses the Old Testament texts of Genesis. Polemical means argumentative, for a limited purpose of making a point in an argument. So a polemical is not a literary motif, it is an argument. So it's something that you're doing, it's the purpose of what you're writing. And that shapes the way you write and how you use literary tools. Here is a definition of allegory. The device of using a character or narrative element symbolically to refer to something else, either abstract, the quest for the Holy Grail is an allegory of man's search for spiritual grace, for example, or specific. The character Gloriana in Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene is an allegory, an allegorical representation of Queen Elizabeth I. In an allegory, there tends to be a one-to-one correspondence between something used symbolically and the point that's being made. So when I use the tomb of Machpelah, the tomb of the patriarchs, in an allegory about our salvation, there's a one-to-one correspondence between that tomb and the empty tomb in which our Lord was laid after his death. He was put in a tomb, entombed. We say he's dead and buried, but he was actually entombed rather than buried. If you don't have a one-to-one correspondence, you can use metaphor. The definition of metaphor is figurative use of a word or phrase to describe something to which it is not literally applicable. The ship plowed through the waters. A ship is not a plow. A plow plows. A ship simply sails. It moves through the waters. Juliet is the sun is an excellent example of metaphor. No, she's not. She is not. It doesn't take 6 minutes or whatever it is for light to get from Julia to the eyes of Romeo. She's not up there in the sky. And here's my favorite example in Stephen Fry's book. There's April in her eyes. That is a metaphor, a metaphoric use of language. An important tool in using the Old Testament is also a trope. And Stephen Fry defines that. It's T-R-O-P-E. Any rhetorical or poetic trick, device, or figure of speech that changes the literal meaning of words. Metaphor and other common figures are tropes. And I guess you could say that in Galatians, St. Paul uses the two mothers of Abraham's sons as tropes. When he says these things are an allegory, he goes on to say that, Sarah is the Jerusalem above, speaking of the Holy Land as an allegory also, which is free. And Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, which is enslaved. And he's using Hagar as a figure for the law, because that's what he's arguing about. He's arguing about the continuing role of the law in the early Christian community, specifically the rite of circumcision. He makes an allegory out of chapter 16 and 18 of Genesis, and he uses the characters as tropes, uses them symbolically for a larger purpose. So those are some literary devices that we hear used. St. Paul actually uses the word allegory to describe what he does with the scriptures, what he does with the Old Testament. And my use of the tomb of the patriarchs and relating it to the tomb of our Lord is similarly an allegory that helps explain the relationship, the literary relationship between the promised land in the Old Testament and our promised land of heaven, our place of eternal rest and peace, the place where God truly is sovereign always, and always will be, because it is his land he has promised us, our permanent home in him.